Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Todd. Thank you for joining me in this conversation that seems to be all over the place today. Maybe it's just because I did some research on this, but it seems to be in the news and in a lot of conversations. And that is the topic of parent and child estrangement. And we're going to be talking a little bit about what that is and how to make sense about why that happens. And I come at this not only from kind of the academic, clinical side of things, where I've seen this in the clinic, but I've also experienced this firsthand. And so I understand, at least from a child's perspective, why sometimes we have to cut ties. And so just to get started, let's just talk a little bit about what this whole phenomenon is and how common it is and all of that. And I think it's important to understand that kind of parent and child estrangement doesn't just happen at the spur of the moment. It is usually the final stage of a long, slow relational breakdown where one person finally says, you know what, I just can't keep doing this. I can't stay in this relationship the way that it currently exists. And unfortunately, even though I hate to do it, I'm going to have to just break ties because this is just continuing to wound me, the way that this relationship is structured. And sometimes that decision is necessary for safety, for healing. Sometimes it's driven by some kind of unresolved conflict or some kind of misinterpretation or family triangulation, particularly when there's a divorce and one parent gets their kid to dislike the other one, and so, or sometimes outright lies about the other parent to get the child to turn against the other parent. So estrangement is rarely just about cutting someone off. It is often about a failed bid for safety, dignity, boundaries, recognition, or repair. And not just once, but that there has been a pattern where there has been numerous bids to try to resolve, and those just have not worked out. And so oftentimes the child is just like, I can't do this anymore. I've got to step away. So the question that's important to examine is, why is this happening? Why are children cutting ties with their parents after their parents have loved and cared about them and all of that? And it really comes down to a few different things. One is that there has been some kind of history of emotional, physical, or sexual abuse between the parent and the child. So the child has been either belittled, abandoned, physically beaten, or been sexually molested or raped. There has been just a pattern of that throughout childhood. And so once that child reaches adulthood, in order to keep themselves safe and get away from that really we would call a toxic environment, get away from that and just cut ties with their parents. Also, situations where kids face constant criticism. Their parents feel very, very controlling or manipulative, or have poor boundaries, where their parents are trying to micromanage their lives or don't respect privacy, things like that. That can be a cause. And even kids feeling chronically feeling dismissed or invalidated or emotionally unseen, which oftentimes happens when parents are not emotionally involved or emotionally responsive to their kid, where their kid is kind of like, why am I even here? My parents are so busy doing their own thing, right? Or there may be a lot of addiction or all of that, but it's just like, I don't see seen here. I don't, I constantly feel dismissed. I feel like it doesn't matter if I'm even in this family. And in order for me to maintain some kind of sense of integrity, I have to step away from that situation. There are some instances where, and you've seen this oftentimes in the GLBT community, which is really sad, is that parents just will not accept their children. So if there's a child who's gay, for example, there's just, this, you're no longer my son, or if you become a Presbyterian, or, if you vote for Trump or something like that, there's some kind of conflict over values, religion, politics, sexuality, or you marry somebody that, your parents didn't approve of, or, they didn't approve of your parenting or your lifestyle. And that was this constant state of conflict and tension between the two of you. There are some kids who are just like, why do I remain engaged? Why do I stay there? Because it's not as though I'm getting any kind of support. And even if it's not financially, even just emotionally, just parents being proud of me or happy to see me or wishing me well. It's like, if that's not happening, and instead what I'm getting is, constant, I'm not doing it right. Or I'm not making the right choices, or I'm voting for the wrong person, or I shouldn't be gay, then you have a tough choice to make. It's like, do I remain in contact with a family who is going to be constantly barraging me with these judgments and barbs, or do I step away, set a boundary around that, just say, you know what, I'm unwilling to accept that, and move forward, grieve the loss of that, but then be able to live the life that you were meant to live, right? Kids want to have a relationship with their parents. They want to be close to them. They want to have their parents in their life. But for whatever reason, when they make an attempt to connect with the parent, then they end up getting re-wounded. And that is, that's just a reality of a lot of people who end up cutting ties with their parents. It's like, I would love to have a relationship with my parents. There's nothing more that I would like than to have a relationship with my parent, or with my parents. But every time I do, I just end up getting re-wounded. And so I have to step away. I have to just cut ties with these family members. And so often what happens when that kind of scenario emerges is that, as kids, and this is true in my case and in a lot of cases that I see, right, is that, as a child, it doesn't matter how old we are, there's still a part of us that really wants to have a relationship with our parents. But every time I try that, I end up getting re-wounded. And despite that, I'm always looking for some glimmer of hope, like maybe they've changed now, or something has switched, and now there's an opportunity to, to reconnect, and they'll be different. And one of the things that is so hard is that sometimes there is that glimmer of hope. A parent will suddenly say things or do things where it gives us some sense of, oh, wow, something is now something is now different. Now I can reconnect. And then we try that. And more often than not, that ends up being a disappointing or a wounding experience. And then we're like, oh, why do I even bother? Why do I do this? Why do I keep going back? Why do I keep putting myself in a situation to be hurt? And that is such a common phenomenon. I've heard it said that estrangement is often grief without a funeral. And that, I think, really fits. It is a form of divorce where there is a death of a relationship. But unlike divorce, where we have some cultural language and some cultural understanding of a split between two spouses, where there just was a growing sense of incompatibility. And over time, the conflict and the inability to repair and the inability to move forward in a positive way eventually made both of them just go, you know what? Or one of them say, you know what? I gotta bail. I gotta be done. And as a society, we have some understanding of that, right? Because we've seen it, and we have divorce courts and we have laws and we have all of these kinds of things, that help us navigate through and understand a divorce. And the same thing is true when somebody passes. We have funerals, we have, laws, we have traditions, we have all of these things that help us process through that loss and that grief. And unfortunately, there just isn't that with estrangement. There's just this odd sense of being in a state of grieving without being able to put any real context around it. And, parents oftentimes may feel a lot of shame or humiliation or rage, confusion and helplessness, and this kind of vague, ambiguous sense of loss. And I sometimes hear them say, we did everything for them, and, look at how they treat us, and all of those kinds of and things like that. And the adult children will oftentimes feel this sense of grief, but kind of relief at the same time. There's kind of this mixture of both, where there's a grieving of the hope of being able to reconnect with their parent and have a healthy relationship, right? There's this sense of, missing the parent they wish they had, while knowing that they just cannot safely re-engage with the parent. And so there's this sense of relief that now I'm not going to be hurt by that, but there's also this loss of hope. There's this loss of this parent that I wished could have been there for me. The loss of the parent that that I never had. And this kind of brings me to just something that I want to mention, because this is true with all relationships, even ones that are headed for divorce court, is that even in bad relationships, most people do most things right most of the time. It's just that there are certain times when things do not go well and cause some woundedness that linger. And those wounds start really defining the nature of the relationship. And so a lot of times parents are very confused, and it's like, God, look at all of the things that we have done for them without understanding where some of that woundedness may have come from, or how the way in which they communicate with their children may be shaming or undermining their sense of self. And oftentimes, adult children don't necessarily have the language or understanding of what about that was hurtful. And, frankly, sometimes they may have tried to communicate that if they knew how, but that wasn't received by the parent, or they got a message that it is not okay for you to say that. One example that happened in my own life is my sister and myself and my wife and her husband all flew to go spend Thanksgiving with my mother, which was one of the rare times that we all got together with her. And my mom was one of these types of people where it's kind of this toxic positivity where it's like everything was always fine, everything's fine, where it's just like we always have to pretend that nothing bad is happening and that everything is happy. She couldn't go to her own mom's funeral because that would be too sad. And during Thanksgiving, she was like, "Oh, Todd, you were such a happy boy. And, you always had a big smile on your face and always had a lot of friends." And I remember looking at her and just saying, "Mom, I attempted suicide. I was really depressed." And she looked at me and she said, "Don't you ever say that to your mother again." And at that moment, I knew that it was not possible for me to have any kind of relationship with my mother because we could not talk about what was real. We had to pretend that everything was okay and that she just didn't want to hear what was happening with me, right? She just wasn't interested in hearing anything bad or talking about anything negative. It all had to be, it all had to be positive. And it's sad, right? Because whenever I had tried to make an overture to my mom, right, to reconnect, there was just this unwillingness to talk about what was real. And she is an example of how people can do most things right most of the time, but that statement at Thanksgiving dinner and many statements like that were so hurtful and so dismissive that I had to just step away because it profoundly affected me and my ability to show up in that relationship. So far, we've talked a lot about the kid side of things and why kids decide to step away. And, I think it'd be helpful just to talk a little bit about the parents' side and their common responses to the experience of having a kid essentially reject them and say, "You know what? I don't want you in my life." And one of the biggest, I think, is just this sense of shock and bewilderment. Like, I have no idea where this came from. And, they're oftentimes very sincere, but that usually is some indication that that they weren't paying attention or they weren't hearing what was going on with their kids. Much like my mom, where it was like, I tried reaching out and communicating, and there was just a shutting down of that. And then there was like, I don't know why he doesn't call me more often, right? And that's, from the parent side, and I totally understand that shock and bewilderment, but oftentimes that happens, right, from not being responsive or not being present with the challenges that your kid was going through. There's also, and I mentioned this a minute ago, there's also this kind of defensive, after everything I did for you, this is how you treat me sort of thing. And it's all about, the sacrifice that I did. And it's never about curiosity about what's going on with the kid, right? When parents get into that defensive place, I oftentimes say, that's curious that you're not even reaching out to your child right now and saying, help me understand what's going on. What makes it so difficult for you to be present with us? Why are you rejecting us? And being able to just sit with that and hear them without becoming defensive, right? And this kind of speaks to that whole thing. You can do most things right most of the time, right? I mean, you could do a lot of amazing things for your kids. But when kids need some support, when they need you for some reason, and it doesn't feel like you are present or you're there or you care, or you understand them or you hear them or you validate them or value them, then there can be this sense of, you're willing to do everything on the surface. You bought me a car, but man, when I was really struggling and I needed some help, I just felt shut down, right? And so it's really important for parents to be able to just be present with their kids. Sometimes parents will they'll blame somebody else, like, it could be it's the other spouse or it's a therapist or somebody outside of the relationship with me and my child must be the culprit. And sometimes, honestly, it is. And you see this in triangulation situations where there's an uncomfortable divorce and one parent starts saying all kinds of things about the other parent, which may or may not be true, in an effort to punish the other parent by depriving them of their relationship with their child. And so there are situations where that happens. And so I don't want to just dismiss this, this argument, because sometimes that's just reality, that the estranged parent would love nothing more than to be present and listen to and validate and just, do all of the good parenting things with their kid. But because of the nature of the split with the other parent, being so acrimonious, or the other parent feeling so hurt that they decide to use their child as a weapon against them, there are times when that is a real thing. But there are other times too, kind of like the defensiveness, where I've had parents where it's like, certainly it's nothing I did. It must have been that they were, they watched too many YouTube videos on, how terrible parents are, or they went to their therapist and their therapist turned them against me, or something like that. When in fact, it's like, no, man, I mean, the therapist may have been working with them to say, you know what, your pain is real. And what you need to do is set some boundaries around what you're willing to accept and what you're not. And here's how, perhaps you can approach that relationship in a way that is not harmful to you. And if that parent is still unable to meet you there, then you may have to make a decision to distance yourself from that relationship. And those kind of conversations happen in therapy all the time. And it's not necessarily that a therapist is turning a child against a parent, but rather helping a child who perhaps had not had a very strong sense of self or had not developed very good boundaries, learning how to take care of themselves better and to set some boundaries and make some decisions about what kinds of things they will accept and what kinds of things they will not, and developing some language for navigating those boundaries in a healthier way. And if a parent is unable or unwilling to meet them there, then sometimes that child, in order to grow and differentiate themselves and heal and develop their own self-concept, may have to step away. One thing that is very common with parents, which I think is a little bit unfortunate, is this whole thing where they're like, oh my God, I must have been a horrible parent. Everything looks terrible. I must have just been so awful that the kid doesn't want to have anything to do with me. And, it's that looks kind of like they're taking some accountability for some of the things that they did wrong. But in actuality, it's not. It's really just kind of collapsing inward to, it's all about me, it's all about me, it's all about me, instead of saying, you know what? I feel horrible that my child doesn't want to have anything to do with me, and I sincerely want to understand what it is that I did so that I can somehow repair that, so that we can move forward in a positive way. And how that would look from a parent's perspective toward a child would be to say, hey, can we chat? Like, I notice that you've really stepped away from me, or you've gone no contact or something like that. It's like, I want you to know that I feel terrible about that. I mean, that you feel like that was preferable than remaining any kind of contact or maintaining any kind of contact with me. And I would sincerely like to understand, and I'm willing just to be here and hear some feedback from you about what it is that the kinds of things that I would do that were hurtful to you, not in a place to defend myself, but rather so I can understand where our breakdown in the relationship came from, so that I can repair that, so that I can show up differently for you in a way that is more helpful to you, so that we can perhaps repair, if even a bit, so that I don't lose you. And that is very important, right? And that's a very tough thing for a lot of parents to do when so much of the time there's so much self-orientation in the parent, where they're like, well, look at all the things that I've done, and it must be somebody else, or it's the child's fault. For them to step outside of that frame and look at things in a different way, just saying, all right, this is not about blaming the child, it's not about blaming me. I'm simply trying to understand what, and then collaboratively move forward with that without becoming defensive, without, just like, oh my God, I'm such a horrible person. Because again, that's just turning everything toward you. And when parents can actually do that, it's surprising how many kids are willing to come back, because it's not like the vast majority of kids, it's not like they think it's cool or awesome to go no contact with their parents. They'd love nothing more than to have that relationship restored. They just oftentimes feel like it's not possible. Another reaction that I oftentimes see when there's this kind of alienation thing is just kind of rage and retaliation on the part of the parent, where it's like, how dare you? I'm going to write you out of the will. and attacking the spouse, or trying to contact grandchildren and turning them against you, or, making, social media posts talking about how horrible their kid is, things like that. And I actually had a stepmom who did that to my father once, where they were both professors. And when they went through divorce, she walked in, and in a classroom full of students, she just raged for about half of the class about what a horrible human being my father was. It's like, oh, that's just so crazy. This isn't just about parent-child. I mean, this kind of thing also happens in adult relationships. But when those kinds of things happen between parent and child, it ends up just further pushing any hope of reconciliation further and further away, and is really unfortunate. Most of the time, that kind of thing, that kind of rage and retaliation from the parent's side, comes from some of their own woundedness, oftentimes from their own childhood experiencing abandonment, and just kind of the terror and the protest that oftentimes happens with that. And so there's like this, if my child abandons me, then a lot of that old trauma stuff just gets triggered in the moment. And it's not like when some of that abandonment trauma gets triggered, oftentimes, our normal thinking part of ourselves just gets pushed out of the driver's seat, and that emotional rage or that anger, that vengeance just kind of takes over the driver's seat of our lives, and we act and say things that later we're like, oh my God, I cannot believe that I said that. I can't believe that I did that. I feel terrible. But you can't, unfortunately, you can't undo that. And so that is a reaction that oftentimes happens. Sometimes you see parents, in kind of a similar vein, they try to pressure the kid to come back, or, pursue them, and they'll say things like, well, yeah, I don't remember it the same way. I want to understand how you experienced me, but then, oftentimes it's, whatever the child says is dismissed. But when, like I mentioned a minute ago, but when those overtures can be acknowledged, and there can at least be a meeting of the minds where the parent can at least understand what the child experienced, then there's at least some possibility, if not for full repair, at least for there not to be a complete estrangement. And there are some, parents who, this whole thing may not be their fault or their doing at all, right? I mean, that can happen in triangulation kind of situations, or, the reality is that, narcissists aren't all parents, right? I mean, a perfectly decent family can have a child who is, has addiction or some personality disorder, or something like that, where the parent just has to say, I love you. I understand that you just need to cut ties. I'm willing to listen and respect that boundary, and I'll just leave a door open. If at some point you decide to come back, then I'm willing to have that conversation, right? We can talk about that and explore what that should look like. I guess the last thing that I'll say on this whole topic, other than it's just, it sucks. It sucks for both parents and kids when this happens. It's not that either one gets away from this without experiencing grief and hurt, right? And the goal, may not always be reconciliation. I mean, that can happen a lot of times, but sometimes it just can't occur for a number of reasons, right? Either the parent or the child are just unwilling to budge or to move or take accountability. If there is ever going to be any chance, it's going to be important to be able to tell the truth without contempt. We need to be able to create boundaries without being cruel. We need to be able to grieve without being bitter and remain open to repair whenever repair becomes possible. And that will only be possible when both sides are able to just hear each other, accept each other's reality, and work collaboratively to move forward in a positive way. And sometimes that could be the two get emotionally closer, and sometimes it won't. But parents and children have a different relationship than two adults that form a marriage. There is always going to be a bit of a lifetime bond between the two. And so any possibility or any way that bond, that tie can be as frictionless as possible, even when there has to be distance, is preferable than carrying a lot of anger and bitterness and resentment toward the other. This is one of those situations where just understanding the dynamics involved will help us navigate through those situations in an intentional way and in the best way we can, given a very tough situation and an unfortunate situation. It's when parents and children have to separate, or when children in particular have to separate from their parents, like I had to do with mine. It's not a joyous thing. It is a sad thing. And it is one that causes grief. There's always a second guessing of, God, am I being unreasonable here? Am I being the bad guy? And is there any hope? And so I wish there were just some magic words that I can say, but there just aren't in a situation like this. So the best that I can offer, I guess, is that I hope that this at least illustrated or helped you understand, clarified might be a better word, of just the dynamics involved in a situation like this, an unfortunate situation like this. And so if you're in that situation, I wish you all the best. Having lived through it, it's tough. It's just a tough deal, and there always isn't a great answer on how to move forward. So we'll see you in the next episode.